Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're zooming in from today. Capire's offices are on the Wurundjeri lands, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people in the room here today. As was said, it's 10 o'clock. We're kicking off now, but we see that other people are joining us, so we'll let them kind of come in as we go. I'm Sarah. I'm an associate and a client development lead here at Capire Consulting Group. I'm joined also by Beck Yandel from Capire as well, who'll be helping us out today with some of our mentee questions and a Q&A at the end. And we're delighted to have Monica Forson from the Victorian Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission, who's a senior advisor of community engagement there. So a quick overview of Capire's Learning Labs. So for those who might be attending your first Learning Lab today, it's really about us discussing new and emerging practice and any key kind of topics in the engagement field. It's really about also sharing skills and practical tips. So we encourage people to use the chat function to share any tips, resources, stories from your own practice that might add to our conversation today. A reminder to you all as well that today's session is recorded, so you'll be able to share this with your colleagues and networks after the session as well, and reflect back on the conversation. So I'll hand over to Beck first before we can run through a quick mentee about where people are joining us from, and then we'll kick off our conversation.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I'm just going to share a screen which will have a QR code. So you can either use your phone to scan the QR code, or I'll drop a link in the chat for you to follow as well. And so this will allow you to answer a couple of questions. So I'll just let everyone get a chance to join, and then I'll move on to our first question. So you can join the link that's just been put in the chat. You can see we've got a couple of people who've joined. So our first question is just, where are you joining us from today? We'd love to hear. We get a very diverse group for these webinars, so we'd love to hear whereabouts you're joining us from. Wonderful. Sounds like we've got quite a few people coming to us from Melbourne, from Wurundjeri country. A few different councils being represented, which is wonderful. So we've got even some Hobart friends from Nipaluna joining us. That's really great to see a diverse group joining us today. Our next question is, obviously today we're going to be talking about intersectionality and engagement. So we'd love to hear what you're most hoping to learn about today. Right, getting some answers coming through. We want to be learning about best practice approaches, how intersectionality and engagement can fit together, what best practices exist, getting up to speed with current best practices. Seems like it's some pretty clear themes coming out here, getting a better understanding about different approaches and that real practical lens of how we can apply intersectionality into our work. So some really clear themes coming about what we're hoping to learn today. I'm sure we'll be able to cover off most of these for you today as well. Wonderful. Got a few more coming in about best practice, understanding how to have safe engagement in intersectional space, about innovative ideas to encourage engagement within the organisation. I think there's some really, really great answers there. Well, now it's time to actually get stuck in, so I'll pass back over to Sarah, who can take us away.
Thanks so much, Beck. That's awesome. I've just made a note of a couple of those points that came up there. I think, as Beck said, we hopefully will cover off some of those today, but I also will end the session with talking about where to from here and some kind of next steps in terms of keeping this conversation going. So Monica and I met at the IAP2 conference. We spoke on a panel together about intersectionality. We've both got very different backgrounds, but some similar experiences and obviously some nuances in what we've experienced in our professional and personal lives. And so we connected last year at the conference and then have kept the conversation going and talked about how we can continue to kind of elevate voices in the intersectionality space. And so it's my privilege to introduce Monica. I'll read out her bio. Monica is a highly regarded community engagement professional with 10 years experience in the Australian government and international development sectors. With experience working across government and community organisations, Monica has worked in a variety of policy, advocacy, engagement and education roles. Her career has included direct service delivery in the youth sector and policy advisory and advocacy roles with diverse communities across human rights, mental health and law enforcement settings. Monica currently works at the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, where she oversees the Commission's engagement with multicultural and multi-faith communities and leads the Reducing Racism project. So it's wonderful to have Monica here. So we'll be in conversation for about 40 minutes. I've got some questions for Monica that we'll talk through. And then what we'll do is towards the end of the session, we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for questions. So what will happen is that throughout the session, we invite you to use the chat function to put your questions or observations, and Beck will collect those up and we'll have a conversation at the end about your questions Monica and I can respond to. So Monica's joining us today from Ghana, actually. She's zooming in from faraway lands, and it's 11 o'clock at night there. So we'll also be on our coffee while Monica's maybe on the tea or herbal teas. But thanks for joining us, Monica, at this time. So I'd just like to start with a question for you around something more broader. I know that there's different definitions around intersectionality and where that's emerged from. But in your words, how do you define intersectionality? And why is intersectionality a focus for engagement practitioners?
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And whilst I'm not on country in Australia, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the place that I work remotely at currently in Australia. And our Victorian Equal Opportunity Commission office is on the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung land, and the land was never ceded. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this session this evening for me. Please let me know if there's any like IT glitches or anything, but for me, I think talking about intersectionality is almost an everyday occurrence at the Commission. We're always talking about the need to be intersectional. Have we thought about intersectionality here? And often people say the term as almost like a buzzword at the moment, but might not necessarily know the genesis of the word, or what do we actually mean when we're talking about intersectionality, particularly in community engagement practice. So if you look at the definition online, it really is about bringing attention to the different experiences that people have, the different positionalities that people have in society based on their gender, their ethnicity, their race, sexual orientation, ability, their socioeconomic class. And the idea that you don't just bring one element of yourself to work to a particular environment, that we have different elements that all intersect at once. So for me, they're overlapping themes. So it could be that I'm a woman, that I'm young, or maybe not so young anymore, that I'm from an African heritage, depending on my social economic class as well. All these things coming together, and overlapping can add to the inequalities that I face or the people that we work with face. And it's really quite important to understand the hierarchical nature that we have in our society. Intersectionality came from the Black feminist space in America, where feminism was really talking about issues in a really broad sense, but it wasn't inclusive of the unique experiences that underrepresented communities had. And at the time, that was for Black feminists in that space. And a lady by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw created that term, and she's quite well known, for that. I think that when we're thinking about intersectionality as well, these dynamics really just depend on where you are in the locality. That, my experience in Melbourne is different to my experience currently in Ghana, that despite me having the same attributes, depending on the context and the situation, power and privilege differs. And I think for the easiest way that people understand this is that white men generally have a lot of power in our world, but then women, racialized people, non-heterosexual people, transgender people, for example, or people with disabilities experience more vulnerabilities. And so if we were to look at intersectionality from an access, like on an access point, that, depending on the different elements that we have means that we're more or less marginalized. And I think one last point on defining what intersectionality is, it's not just a theory about my identity and the difference that I have in the world. It's really about power dynamics, about oppression. So it's really about us thinking critically about our position in the world and the clients that we work with, the communities that we work with, and realizing that we don't all see the world in the same way, that our experience is very much impacted and tainted or tinted, by the different attributes that we have. And I think for me, I was quite young when I remember hearing about intersectionality. It was at university with a friend from America, and she was really exasperated about an experience she had in Melbourne walking on Lygon Street. And she just said to me, like, Monica, don't you realize I'm a Black woman, from a particular cultural background in an Australian context? She was talking about an experience of racism at that time. And I was really blissfully ignorant because I hadn't heard of the term intersectionality yet, nor had I really considered these things. It manifests itself in many different ways. But I think that we could all probably speak to a moment where we've, experienced sort of the oppression that intersectionality gets us to think about in our everyday lives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Monica. There's so much there, I think, for us to unpack and discuss. And I think when we were talking about this topic as well, it was about trying to keep the conversation within this amount of time, because I think, as you say, there is so much more to kind of go into, and even just what you're speaking about in terms of not just engagement practice, but in everyday life, the way that intersectionality plays out and impacts people in their lives. In terms of, I know you're doing work around reducing racism, and the conversation you said about everybody kind of having different perspectives and how intersectionality plays out in their kind of context. Do you have any examples from your work kind of in the last few years about working with multi-faith communities and how, I suppose, intersectionality does impact or influence the conversations and experiences with the people that you're working with?
Yeah, there are so many examples that come to mind, but I think the first one that immediately I wanted to speak to is really about our engagement with faith communities. And so quite often when we're delivering sessions or wanting to do programming, particularly for the Muslim community, we're quite aware of the power dynamics within those community groups. And we quite often think about, well, how do we tailor our service? How do we make sure we're reaching the most marginalized or the person that requires this information the most? So quite often we have sessions that are separated by gender. At times we also have sessions separated by someone's role or seniority within the faith group. So we might have sessions for imams and sheikhs, and then sessions for the general community, just acknowledging that the messaging might be tailored and different, but also about creating safe spaces for those people to have really good and conducive conversations. I know that for my colleagues currently working in the change and suppression space, that's a model that they're implementing. Some really tough topics that they're having to speak with people of faith who have different views on the topic. But at the end of the day, our job at the Human Rights Commission is to provide legal information and help people understand their rights and obligations under the law. So we don't shy away from difficult conversations, but it's more so about, well, how do we have a conversation that results in the most impact and the most behavior change?
Absolutely. And I think, as you said earlier, in terms of power and privilege, and I know there's that kind of and I know we'll talk about this a bit later, but the kind of tokenistic phrases or tick box kind of phrases like, show up as your whole self and bring your whole self to spaces. But there is that power and privilege that comes with that. For some people, it's not safe to be your whole self in all experiences and in all settings. So I think when you were talking about the tailoring of sessions around, in terms of their role within their communities or within genders, or, so in terms of getting that information from people, like how do you go about, I guess, understanding those needs and then being able to act on those needs? So I think that for some people, as you mentioned before, that that some practitioners maybe do shy away from difficult conversations, or potentially even at an organizational level, it's the too hard basket. It's kind of like, we're engaging with LGBTIQ plus communities, for example, with my background, but it's a very broad, we'll talk to the loudest voices, some of the communities that have more access and more privilege, and maybe those who are left out of the conversation remain left out of the conversation. So on a practical level, like how do you find out those specific needs within groups, and then how do you kind of then work to enable there to be other opportunities to engage those groups?
That's a really good question. And I think I was going to mention earlier that quite often when we talk about intersectionality, we really see it as a theoretical framework to kind of guide our practice. But I think it can be more practical, and it really should be viewed as a tool of engagement rather than the way that we do engagement, the theoretical element. And I think quite often I've worked in local government spaces as well, and we often just see community as a whole. We need to serve our constituents, we need to serve our community, but a citizens in general approach doesn't always work. And so if we think about intersectionality and we think about it from an equality and human rights perspective, I think it broadens our understanding of kind of, one, the necessity of intersectionality, but also it's really about how we view community, how we remove our biases that we may or may not have, and think about really doing a deep dive and understanding of the people that we're here to serve, that we're here to represent, and here to provide service delivery. So I think as well, coming from the Human Rights Commission, we also see intersectionality as a tool to make sure that we're meeting our obligations under human rights. So to make sure that we're not harming community, that we're not abusing community, that we're not indirectly discriminating or disadvantaging a particular cohort. So I think the most simplistic way to understand in a practical sense what intersectionality could look like in our settings and engagement is really doing a needs analysis, and through that really thinking quite broadly about who are we here to serve, and also beyond that point, who are we missing, who's not at the table. And I remember a few years ago, I was in a facilitation session, and a person said to write down the name of your 10 closest friends. And then, you write whoever it is. And then at the next few elements of this game or whatever, or this icebreaker, was then to look at kind of, well, what's their gender? What's their race? What's their sexual orientation? Are they able-bodied or not? Blah, 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 blah. And then you end up realizing that we really socialize with people that have similar experiences to us generally. And I think that does frame kind of how we work and how we communicate and what we see are priorities. So I think intersectionality as a tool enables us to kind of view community more broadly, start from scratch, and really make sure that we're considering everyone's unique needs in our programming and community engagement offerings.
Wonderful. Thanks, Monica. And I think to that point where you say about, it's a tool, intersectionality as a tool, and the idea around reflection and kind of critical analysis, I guess, of who you're engaging and who you're not engaging. And for people who feel that maybe it's like, well, I've never worked with multi-faith communities, or I haven't worked in LGBTIQ plus communities or people with disability, living with disability, are there some kind of key reflective questions or reflective prompts that you would suggest, for people to consider when they're thinking about their approach, and even to discuss with their teammates or colleagues? Or, what are some of those reflective prompts that you think could enable that conversation around intersectionality?
Yeah, I think what I mentioned before as well, like, who are we serving in our community? who is missing from the table, who requires additional accessibility considerations. I don't think that it's that dissimilar from what we would do in the disability space, or even when we think about our work with First Nations communities. I think there's a lot that needs to be done in that space, but equally, if we look at it from a strength-based perspective, there's a wealth of information and modalities that show us what best practice looks like. I think we're at a point now where we're thinking about what next practice looks like in the intersectionality space, beyond it just being a term that we use, and rather than just being a tick box approach. But I think it really just depends on the situation. So quite recently, we did a session with multicultural people from the LGBTIQ plus community. And I'm like, oh, I'm not really sure if I'm, capable of doing this sort of work. And I thought, well, why not? I'm a community engagement practitioner. There, if you treat everybody with dignity and respect, there are ways about going about your work, but also being comfortable in what might be perceived as uncomfortable, but also acknowledging that we are going to make mistakes and to approach everything with kindness, which might seem like really wishy-washy things to say. But for me, it was like, okay, well, how do I make sure that this consultation is delivered in a culturally safe way for this community? What does cultural safety look like for LGBTIQ plus members of multicultural community, specifically the African community? How do I make sure that, that we're providing enough time to hear from that community group, that within that intersections that we're considering age and gender and all these different elements? And so it might seem at first like, oh, you're just running a general consultation, like, why do you have to overthink it? But there was a lot of planning and making sure that the right voices are in the room, that were they comfortable, even we were doing this online, so comfortable with their cameras on, off, how they wanted to be communicated after the session. There's still a lot of fear in sharing who they are, or explaining who they are authentically to themselves, let alone to the broader community. And what I found interesting about that session that I'm referring to is this was the first time that many people had entered a space and identified themselves from the LGBTIQ plus community. So I think it was really important to make sure that was a safe place, and by and large they said it was, and an outcome from that is now they're all wanting to connect afterwards to do some programming together. But I think just treating people with dignity and respect from the get-go, but also if you're not entirely sure of how to approach it, lean on allies and lean on civil society or grassroots community groups. I don't think there should be an assumption that community engagement practitioners know what to do all the time, but I think it's about having strong connections with communities of focus to help guide us in our work, to make sure that we're doing it to the best of our abilities in the most safe way.
Absolutely. And I think, like, to your point, I think as an engagement practitioner and working in any sector, I think it is our role to kind of create spaces for conversations. We might not have all the answers or understand all the complexities of what a community group or individual's experiencing, but it is our role to think about how do we create a space for those conversations to happen, and how do we enable a safe and inclusive environment for people to actually share the nuances of their experience. So I think that speaks to that experience, that example you're giving. And I think that point about leaning on grassroots organizations and allies, and that we don't have to have all the answers. And I guess that leads us into our next kind of question around the challenges. So what do you think are the biggest challenges in the intersectional spaces, and think about intersectionality as a tool? What are some of those bigger challenges for engagement professionals and for organizations?
Yeah, I think there are actually a lot of challenges with intersectionality. And I think it's the fact that a lot of people don't understand what it is, and it's really hard to get buy-in. That you often see people say, oh, well, why do we need to do that? It's just a fluff term. We don't need to do that, or we're already intersectional, or is this just some political correctness gone mad? Like, you do hear those sorts of comments, and it's really hard at times to counteract that. I've also heard people say, is it the oppression Olympics? And people trying as much as possible to be as intersectional as possible. And I think those are really divisive sorts of ways of thinking about it, and not constructive to good community engagement. So I'd say that some of the challenges would be having the political will within our organizations, leading from the top to really understand what intersectionality means, using it as a tool, but also getting the buy-in to make sure that they're willing to go on this transformation journey to do it effectively. That it's not just a purely administrative task or something associated with a grant or, whatever, that we really do mean it to do intersectional work authentically. And I think to do it authentically means that you need to have buy-in from the highest level to make sure that we're resourced adequately to do intersectional work. Quite often you hear people say we work in silos, that, we've got a multicultural liaison officer doing this work. We have the LGBTIQ plus advisor, we have the gender expert, and whatever other intersectional sort of role we have within our organizations. They're all resourced differently. They're all being given different budgets. But when we're talking about, okay, well, how do we work together as a collective? I think a lot of organizations are still really grappling with how to resource intersectional work properly, from the budget to the time to the staffing needs. I mentioned about collaboration and partnerships a moment ago, but I think that's really important. It can be an isolating journey to do this by ourselves. And as I said before, we can't be experts in everything. So I think it's about having the right experts around us through reference groups or whatnot, and making sure that we're always wanting to learn. And there's all different forms of intersections, and just being aware and up to date with new terminology, but also new stakeholders that need to have their voice heard. When we think back about what intersectionality means and why we're doing it, it's about listening to the most oppressed in our communities, and quite often they're not going to be the ones with the loudest voices putting their hands up to be on reference groups. So it's really about making sure we're doing it, scoping out and trying to engage as broadly as possible. What else did I want to say? And I think another element that makes intersectional work hard is the fact that we have limited data. Data is king in many of the areas that we work in, and to try and really advocate that we need to connect with this particular group. Oh, well, where's the data for it? We can't see them in the stats. So if we can't see them, we shouldn't have to do that work. And I think that advocacy piece back up to management, to leadership, that, doing this work will eventually lead to seeing it reflected in data is quite important. And I know the whole conversation about data collection is not just on a community engagement practitioner level. We're having that federally, particularly in the race space and cultural diversity space, about, you're not currently capturing the right data to have a nuanced understanding of community needs and sentiments. So hopefully there'll be that reform work done in the next few years.
Wonderful. Thanks, Monica. There's so many directions we could go in this conversation. I think I will ask a couple of questions. The first is around what you mentioned at the first part of that conversation there around buy-in. So in terms of your advice or recommendations or things you've seen work well in terms of creating that space for buy-in at leadership levels or across an organisation, what are the kind of conversations we should be having around why the intersectional approach, or why that lens is so important to our work? And on the flip side of that, I guess, what do we say to people who might say, but if, and I've heard this before in previous work I've done, if we're focusing on intersectionality, we lose the some of the understanding of individual communities. So it's like, if we're focusing on intersectionality around gender and sexuality and culture, and it's like, do we lose the depth of one of those understandings of identity? So it's, if we're thinking about LGBTIQ plus communities, but then we're also thinking about culture and faith, and do we then lose some of the breadth and depth that we can go into when we're focusing in those silos? So I've heard that as the flip side, so I guess it's that conversation of how do we create buy-in, and what is our response to people who say, well, focusing on intersectionality means that we're spreading ourselves too thin and we're not going to be able to get that depth of conversation.
Oh, that's a really good question. And I do think it goes back to the earlier point I made about, are we working for the broader general citizens in our community, or are we thinking about the most marginalized and thinking about power dynamics all the time? Intersectionality is about oppression and needs, and it's coming from a human rights perspective. So I find those conversations so tiring myself, because I've had to fight those upward battles as well in different spaces. And I think it just comes back to largely those people that keep on commenting about the difficulties with intersectionality are often people that don't have to be or don't have to consider this in their everyday life. They quite often have a level of privilege, which means that they can be almost blind to kind of why this work is important. But I often find when you have these conversations with people who do have diverse experiences, it's like a no-brainer, often is my experience. When it comes to buy-in, I think going back to data can be really important. And even if it's just anecdotal or qualitative data, to kind of present a pitch to these managers or leaders to say, well, this is why I need to do this work. Making sure we're really escalating the voices of people with lived experiences. But again, I think it's centering in the fact that intersectional work is about human rights, a human rights approach, and it is about listening to the most vulnerable in our community. For me personally, I think at the Commission, it's not really a hard ask to get us to think about intersectional practice. And I think we have the most intersectional person as our Commissioner in Ro Allen. And when Ro started in the role, Ro was about how do we make sure that our work is intersectional in every facet possible, in every way possible. And so it's always been an open conversation we've had at the Commission, and it has led us to do a equity audit to really consider, are our programming, from our finance to our communications program, what else did we do? HR, so human resources function. In every sort of element, are we thinking about intersectionality and making sure that internally, but also externally, we're trying to do the best that we can in that space. And even when we are doing the best, how can we do it better? So I think that I've just been in a really fortunate position to have intersectional practice as something that we consider in all our work. I think the most practical sense for me has been we have to do a human rights assessment in a lot of the work that we do before we bring a project or before a project gets funded. So I think that's a really useful exercise to get us to consider who are we working with. I think my final point would be is everything is not for everybody. And I think if we're really clear on that from the get-go with our project development and proposal writing, then that can kind of counteract any comments that are had about kind of the need for generalist versus specialized engagement.
Absolutely. Thank you, Monica. And I think there are a couple of things you mentioned there. I know that the Learning Lab, we focus on sharing resources, practice and skills. I know you mentioned the equity audit and the human rights assessment. Are these things that you can support organisations with or can share any of those resources outside of the Human Rights Commission work as well?
Yes, so we do have a consultancy service where we do offer sort of bespoke, I guess you guys are a consultancy firm as well. So yeah, we both offer these sorts of things. So yeah, that's a service that we do offer to work with organizations on equity audits, but you can readily find human rights assessments online. I think the United Nations has a few different templates that can be used. So yeah, I can refer you, and after the session, I'm more than happy to share some useful documents.
Excellent. Yeah. So after the session,
another comment would be if you do work for a state government or any government entity, you do have mandates under the Charter of Human Rights to consider human rights in your programming. It's not just good enough to consider it, you have to implement it as well. So I'd imagine that if you are working for a state government authority, that you already have some sort of human rights assessment that you must complete.
Absolutely. Thanks for noting that as well, Monica. And I will send out an email after this session with some useful links and information as well, so people can have that rather than in the chat. It might be a bit easier to get through email. It's
Yes.
interesting you mentioned Roe Allen, because I've had a history with Roe as well, and their incredible work in a lot of spaces around LGBTIQ plus communities, but also human rights more broadly. And it leads to a question actually that was asked by one of our attendees today, which I think I'll throw to because it's something I was going to ask anyway, and they've worded it quite nicely there. So the question from the audience, and they preempted my next one, is that champions and leaders from minority groups often have to put in a lot more effort outside their own schedules to advocate, inform, consult on behalf of the group. This can lead to burnout and can be a challenge for continuing engagement. How can we support these key contacts? And so when you spoke about Roe, maybe think about that. I also maybe think about my own experience and yours as well, Monica. I know we've talked about this. What does it mean for people who are, advocating personally, professionally? How can we support these contacts and these people who are doing that work and avoid that burnout?
Yeah, it can be really tiring, I'm not going to lie. And I do think I've had my own experience of burnout being an advocate in this space. And I know that Roe has spoken quite publicly about burnout in certain periods of their professional life when it comes to being a really strong advocate on really difficult and large topics. And it can be a really lonely journey being an advocate in those spaces. I think that I'm really grateful, at least over the last few years, there has been more support provided, particularly to people who identify as women of colour. And so there's been a lot of training, professional development opportunities, and also just networking. As I said, it's a lonely journey, and then you meet other people like, oh wow, we've had really similar experiences. And so even that just peer-to-peer learning and mentoring has been really beneficial to me personally. That I'm not I might be the only one at my commission doing this sort of work, but there are other people that I can learn from, lean on, and work together with to mobilize and do extra work. I think that it's also quite important to acknowledge when you are feeling as though like it might be too much for me at the moment, and knowing when to pause work, not stop work, but pause it, and really having strong boundaries about what you can and what you can't do, and knowing that you can only do things within your own means. I know that over the last few years as well, Commissioner Allen has been a really strong advocate for women of colour, and they sit on the whole of government committee on that. And so it's really interesting when people from intersectional backgrounds become allies for different intersections that they might not have lived experience in. And so there's actually a lot of learning that we're getting through the LGBTIQ plus space, and how they advocate and mobilize and gain resources. It has been really interesting, at least for me personally. So I think there's so much to learn, and even for me as well, having conversations with people with disabilities, and how they approach the work, and how they lobby government and lobby for funds and resourcing. It's all very different. We're all on different journeys as well. So I think it's about knowing when to say no, when to push back, knowing when we are at a point where we could be feeling quite fatigued, but also learning from others that have quite similar journeys in this space.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really useful, that cross learning. And I think that's really important. And I think in terms of that question, because we do get that question a bit as well, being that, Capire community engagement consultants, we get the question around consultation fatigue, certain communities being over consulted. And I think also, particularly when you are living at those intersections, you're often seen as, oh, we need this person to tick all these boxes for, we've covered LGBTI disability, but why this one person being in the space? And I guess the idea is around like, how do you avoid that? And I think one of the things that I've seen from my practice and in my personal life as well, and it'd be great to hear your reflections on this, is that I think a big part of it for me is is it meaningful? So I don't mind being a consultant. I don't mind having kind of opportunities to speak when I can see that there's a purpose, it's meaningful, and there's feedback or closing that loop around how my information is going to be used, and you can see the change it's actually making. So I think that in the communities I've worked with and in my personal and professional life, consultation fatigue is not a thing when you can see that there's a purpose and there's a meaning behind what you're doing, and it's going to create change and affect change. So I think that people get a bit disenfranchised when they feel like it's a tick box. They feel like you're just getting this information to do nothing with it. So I think that that's where that purpose, the meaning, the closing that loop, building those relationships and taking the time to actually invest in communities, I think is really important. Do you see that in your work, Monica, or anything else to add around how to prevent that consultation fatigue from happening?
Yeah, I feel like you've kind of summed it up really well. But yeah, I totally agree with your sentiments that it's about meaningful engagement, and community can tell. You can just take a whiff of your engagement practice and know when it's being genuine or not, or when you aren't really allowing their voice to be heard, and things can be misconstrued. And I think it's really important to think about why people are reluctant to be involved in particular consultations and whatever trauma they may or may not have through engagement. And I think that was seen quite clearly during the COVID lockdowns a few years ago, where people were really apprehensive to speak to government. And when you unpacked why, there were genuine reasons as to why health information being delivered by certain people might not be received well by particular community groups. I might leave that point there, but I think another point about meaningful engagement and fatigue is about, am I being remunerated for my time? Like you have been paid to be here, and quite often people now know that I should be a recipient of a gift card, or I should be given a fee, a speaking fee or whatever. And I think we have seen the commercialization of engagement, and I think it does make it hard for practitioners when we might not have the budget available to make sure we're remunerating people for their time. But most recently, we did this in a regional locality working with people who didn't have much money, were really quite marginalized, but we really wanted to hear from them. And so we did implement, and we not paid them, but like we remunerated them quite sizably for their time. And often people think, oh, that can be a conflict of interest. Are they being genuine in kind of what they're sharing? And there needs to be, a separation of the two. But I would say the converse, actually, because they felt really respected, that they were experts in their own life. And by paying them and remunerating them, that it demonstrated that we cared about what they said, and they stayed there longer than they had to. They were very, very generous in what they did share with us, and it did feel quite meaningful. And we had some elders come up to us afterwards and express that they really enjoyed the session. And they feel that kind of their contributions will be enacted. So I think it's all about understanding who you're working with, but also if you do have budget, please do consider paying people for their time, because we're only getting paid from soliciting the stories and voices from these community members. It's a transactional relationship at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And I think that point, and it makes me think back to my earlier career in community health, where we had limited budget to pay people. It's a real conflict in terms of you want to elevate voices, but when there's limited budget and you're struggling to actually find ways to pay people, I think another thing to consider, as well as payment, and if the payment is minimal, but even if it's not, in any context, is to consider what other opportunities you can provide people. So it's like, I've had experiences where we've done some mentoring with community, we've provided opportunities for, building up skills. So it's not necessarily financial reimbursement, but it's skill building, it's opportunity. It's like, what others, as an engagement professional, other things you want to learn or know about, how can we kind of bring you along some of these experiences and build up your kind of skills and background and resume. And, so it's thinking about those other kind of soft skills or, other opportunities to involve community in, depending on their interests, not just payment, but payment obviously being a priority. And then what other skills and opportunities and experiences can we invite people into? So there's been some really great examples of that at Capire and in other organisations I've worked at, where it's actually extending that relationship, and as you say, honouring people as the experts of their lives. Did you have examples around that as well, Monica?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I often hear stories of people being part of a consultation process, particularly in multicultural communities where there might be a need for a bicultural worker, either for translation, but also just understanding the culture. And seeing those people who may have started off in a completely voluntary role end up being an associate of some sort for the organization, and then becoming community engagement practitioners. So I do think having diverse workforces is really quite important in that space. So I guess it just speaks to the point that you made earlier, that it doesn't have to be about remuneration at the start, but you can support people on their professional journeys in a range of different ways. But I think that, yeah, staffing and having bicultural workers is one way of, that I've seen work really well in the engagement space.
Absolutely. Thanks, Monica. I just thought we've got about 15 minutes left, so we'll open up the floor to questions. I saw a comment from one of our attendees as well around the Gender Equality Act that dictates that public sector orgs do an audit of their public-facing initiatives and projects and have an action plan through the lens of intersectionality. Yes, I worked on the Department of Education's gender equality plan, and so that's a really great step forward in terms of what Monica was talking about earlier around legislation and legislative reform that really prioritizes intersectionality and looking at some of the data when you're looking at staffing data or whatnot, when you're looking at kind of, more than one identity. So it's like women, okay, what's their cultural background? Okay, what's their pay level? And then looking at the differences, based on that intersectionality and that lens is really useful in terms of targeting some specific actions to elevate voices that are often not heard. So thank you for that comment around the Gender Equality Act. It's a great example of how legislation can encourage the thinking around intersectionality. We'll open up the floor to questions. Oh, sorry, Monica.
Add to that as well, sorry, is that
Yeah.
the Gender Equality Act's always spoken of as it's a really good framing about understanding intersectionality, but there's a lot of work to make sure that it was as intersectional as possible. And I'd encourage organizations to say that shouldn't be the minimum that we do in this space, that there's no reason why organizations can't think about that framing further in their own spaces. And that's something that we at the Commission are doing about, okay, we've looked at the gender pay gap. What about the racial pay gap or the able-bodied pay gap? And those are things that are based on that Gender Equality Act and the understanding of legislative reforms, but those are something that we can all do in our own respective spaces. So I think it's a really good stepping stone to think about intersectionality more broadly.
Very true. And to think about, when you, as you say, like thinking about when you're looking at data, layering on the different identities of a person and seeing how that then impacts the outcome of whatever it is you're looking at, whether it's around salary or level of role or whatever it might be in terms of internal audit. So it's a really useful lens, as you say, Monica. And yeah, is there any other questions from the audience? I can see there's a Q&A function and there's also the chat. So please put forward any other questions you might have. Otherwise, we'll keep chatting. But if there's other specific questions, please pop them in. I can see them as they come through and I can ask those of Monica or myself. I guess we're going to, the end usually of our learning labs is around any other practical tips, any other kind of, emerging practice that you're seeing or next practice that you think is useful to kind of flag. In terms of some of the conversation we've had, Monica, in the past, I know that there is that risk of people, and I guess it comes back to that buy-in conversation of maybe organisations or leadership saying, yes, let's take an intersectional approach and thinking that's a way to kind of reduce the amount of engagement that's needed because you're getting multiple voices from less people. So it's kind of thinking about, well, intersectionality is a great approach because it means we can talk to less people who have more opinions about more aspects of their identities. And so we can kind of consolidate our approach into a smaller group of people. I've heard that as well. So it's like the flip side of, not just taking on that breadth and depth of experience, but actually minimizing engagement through talking to people who represent multiple intersectionalities. Is that something you've heard about or think about how we approach that conversation?
Yeah, it is quite interesting, and I have seen like a shift towards that sort of mentality in the last few years. Maybe it's just like agile or lean thinking. It's probably taken from the corporate world to just streamline processes, and I think we'll probably continue to see that sort of comments or framing pushed upon us in tight fiscal environments, particularly within the state government. So I would say where appropriate, push back or provide reason as to why we need to do engagement more broadly and kind of what's the value. So I think it's having a really clear value proposition as to why this work is really important. And I think, again, and I'll keep saying it, it's about intersectional work is about human rights. And I think it's about making sure that nobody's left behind. And I think in a state government environment over the last few years, in a number of different areas, we can see the real harm that is caused when we don't consider everyone's unique needs in our justice system, in the implementation of health services, in our education system as well. So unfortunately, in our society, just more broadly, not just in Victoria or Australia, we often wait for something really tragic to happen, be it a death or a really significant injury or a significant litigation, and it shouldn't have to be at the worst end of the spectrum of someone being harmed or their human rights being abused, that we should start to think about preventative work. And I think that if we think about our engagement practices of like medicine, so to speak, we're really trying to get there before the illness worsens. So yeah, I think it's about always centering our work from a human rights-based approach. And when you tell management that, I think often they're like, okay, we've got to consider it. We don't want to get in trouble for a human rights breach. So I think it's maybe using stronger language to make sure that our leaders know the importance of our work, that it's not just a tick box, it's not just a nice fluffy stuff, that, you know, our work is really important.
Absolutely. I think that's what I think you use whatever language is going to work in your environment, as well as being quite direct, as you say, Monica. And I think you know, creating those opportunities, it's about enabling or removing barriers, but also I think, you know, there is that, as you mentioned earlier, about the way that funding is siloed often around, you know, this bucket of money is for, you know, cultural diverse communities, this bucket of money is for LGBTIQ plus communities. I think it is up to us as practitioners and leaders to think about being creative. Like, how do we get creative then about bringing together these voices? How do we, you know, within our work, how do we build these partnerships and relationships with colleagues, with communities? Let's get creative with this. Let's think outside of the scope of just our kind of patch. And I think that this conversation and as we move forward, we'll continue this opportunity for people to come together. And there is that question in the group chat there in the Q&A about, and it leads to the point I just made there around, do you have any tips as to how to introduce yourself and your organisation to start building a relationship with the community group that historically might be distrusting of you?
Oh, well, I worked for law enforcement for a number of years, so that's an experience that we had day in and day out, unfortunately. And I often found, at least where I worked, some of the best police officers that were able to get into community and talk to people were people who were quite genuine, that it wasn't, here I am and this is what I need to get done. It was often very conversational, having a coffee with a leader, asking if someone could connect you with an individual, and then getting to know them on an individual level. We're all people, we all bleed, you know, red blood, we all have families. Like, there are so many things that unite us rather than you know, detract and like that are different about our communities and ourselves as individuals. And I think coming from like a human-centered approach, that it can lead to really helpful discussions. I think it's also about being like really clear with our intentions as well, and not over promising and under delivering. That if we do have a really clear scope in kind of why we're working, you know, being clear from the get-go about what that looks like, what I can do, what I can't do. I think that's really important. I had another point as well that I wanted to talk about before, but I didn't. It was about the like make sure we're not like homogenizing experiences. And I think that can be really important when thinking about working with new groups or diverse groups that we haven't had much engagement with, that we can often rely on racial stereotypes or you know, just stereotypes more general about particular groups and how they're going to interact and what are important issues for them, and what things we can't say or can't do. And I think we're all individuals, and I think it's about when we are approaching groups of communities and individuals that we haven't worked with, or we don't feel that we have a full understanding of their cohorts, that really coming with no expectations and kind of seeing where the conversation leads. And I think that I've noticed that in my work with interfaith communities quite a bit, where you might have an idea of what you think someone will be like, or what their kind of threshold is for particular conversations, or how they want to be engaged with. And I'm often pleasantly surprised, not pleasantly surprised, but just surprised, I guess. So for me, even though I sit on these sorts of panels and talk about intersectionality, making sure we're not coming with bias, like for me, it's checking my biases and being aware of it and cognizant of it, and also actively making steps to not act in those ways. And I'm sure that's a shared experience other practitioners have as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Monica. And I think to your point, about kind of building those genuine relationships, I think that's certainly been my biggest takeaway over the years in my work plus colleagues' work. You know, I'm thinking about my experience working with First Nations communities who have historical kind of distrust of certain organisations I've worked for in the past for very good reason, and even a colleague of mine from years ago who worked in sex worker communities from different cultural backgrounds, who had a lot of distrust with an organisation around health services as well. The thing that stuck out around why those engagement, or why those relationships worked well, is because we came as people first, not as an organization, not as a, you know, this is what we need to get from you, this is the policy that we're working within, this is the feedback we need on this approach or strategy. It's actually just whatever the kind of thing you're coming with, it's about, you know, leaving that to the side for the first few meetings, especially if there's been a history of distrust, or if there's been a history of discrimination, or whatever it might be. It's coming as a person first. And I think that, you know, really talking about, you know, the person, it's person-centered, it's about the group itself and what they've experienced, and letting that be aired rather than kind of, you know, covering it up and moving on to your kind of what you need from that group. So I think that that genuine relationship building is key, absolutely. And I can see that difference, you know, years ago in terms of that colleague I was speaking about. The first meeting she attended was with her manager, with a group of sex workers, and the manager started talking directly about the policy they were working on around testing and STI, and how they're going to like work with sex straight away from the get-go, knowing there was distrust with this community, and they just did not respond at all. And so I said to my colleague, go back, have a coffee, just have a conversation and about them and about their experiences, and don't worry about the policy you're working on. And so she did that over a couple of sessions and built a relationship with the community that they were working with, and then they were ready to talk. So I think it's about, you know, it takes time. It takes time to build trust and relationship, and it's about being genuine and authentic, about wanting to hear about people's stories. And then once you've got a relationship, you can start to get that richness out of people, you know, because they trust you, and then you can kind of show them how you're going to use that meaningful opportunity to make change and to kind of give that feedback to their communities to share wider.
That's the best part of our career, or like working as community engagement practitioners, is listening to stories. And it shouldn't be, it's extractive, it should be genuine. And I think by and large, that is the experience that many community engagement practitioners have, that they're genuinely curious people. They're genuinely wanting to make a change and make the world a better place. And I think if we could always remind kind of ourselves why we entered this sector, I think that helps quell those fears or reservations or little insecurities we might have about kind of engaging with in new frontiers, I guess.
And I think that's exactly it. And as people on the ground, if this is something that you're challenged with, it's advocating to whoever is internal to you, who is kind of like have ownership over that project, to actually say, this is going to take time. You know, where there's distrust, it will take time to rebuild that and rebuild that relationship. So it's not going to be 3 meetings that we've budgeted for. It might take 6. And because it's about actually building relationship. And so I think as engagement practitioners who are curious, who do want to build relationships around story, it's about kind of communicating that back to whoever's, you know, you need to kind of, you know, I suppose advocate for why you need more time for this work, for it to be meaningful, you know, and to build that relationship and repair. There needs to start with repair often. So I know we've got a few minutes left, so I think we'll share our kind of takeaway messages. And then while we're doing that, if anyone's got any final questions, please pop them in the chat there, and we'll talk about our takeaways, and Monica, you can share your takeaways for people to take with them forward, and then kind of next steps from here. So Monica, do you want to speak to the couple of points there on the slide, but also any other, you know, takeaway messages you wanted to share today?
Yes, the takeaway messages. So I think I've mentioned it a number of times. For me, it's about thinking that the intersectionality is not just a tick box exercise. It's not something we've told the managers that we've done. And it's not just about finding the most intersectional human being on the planet to represent all views for all community members, that we're not a homogenous group, that, we're quite broad. And it's always about thinking about the most marginalized in the communities and making sure that we're speaking and listening to their concerns, because as I've said over and over again, intersectionality, in my opinion, is about ensuring people's human rights are met. So it's a human rights-based approach to our engagement work. And it's about thinking about intra-group diversity.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Monica. I think there are things you've touched on throughout this session. And I think, we can continue to build on this conversation. And I think that really stuck with me when you said around intersectionality as a tool. It's a lens, and it's thinking about, how do we continue to keep unpacking who's in the room, who's not in the room? How do we reduce barriers for people to attend and elevate voices? And I think, people in the space today and others watching the recording afterwards can probably see that there is so much more to discuss. It's an ongoing conversation. Monica and I are speaking here today with experience, but you keep building that experience. There's never, an endpoint to what you learn and know and understand about communities and about intersectionality. So in light of that, Monica and I have talked about a number of times providing opportunities for people to share around challenges or around current practice. So I'll be sending out an email after this session with obviously a link to the recording, some links that Monica will provide around useful resources. And also you've got our Capire website there with some publications and our previous learning labs to kind of continue on this skill building opportunity. But I'll send out a link that has also an opportunity to come and speak and share with us at the Commons in Collingwood, which is where Capire is based. Put on some afternoon tea or morning tea, and we can continue to meet and share about intersectionality and keep elevating voices and sharing our practice. So thank you everybody for attending today. Thank you so much, Monica, for being here with us and sharing your valuable knowledge and experience. And we really appreciate your time today.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a lovely chat.
Thanks, Monica, and thanks, Beck. Until the next time. Thanks, everyone.